Chapter 5, Opening Moves. Opening Moves. They had eaten dinner together in her darkened parlor, neither of them bothering to light the lamps, the pair talking little over the route they would likely take before Cellophane returned to the palace to pack his few belongings, Fritha clearing the dishes and raking out the hearth, the girl set upon leaving the house as tidy as when she had arrived there. Cellophane had returned in little under an hour. Perhaps he did not quite trust her still to be there in the morning, and he had stayed the night at her house. It was a warm evening, Fritha pulling the jumble of blankets from her bed, and they had slept on the back porch, her last waking memory. Cellophane knelt in amongst her swaying tulips as he had made the nightly prayers to his goddess. It was the morning now, the blankets back inside and folded neatly upon her bed once more. Fritha returned to the porch to take one last look over her garden, the tiny chrysanthemum seedlings she had planted just the day before bejeweled with dew in the hazy dawn light. She would never see them bloom, but she had asked her old neighbor to keep them watered all the same. Fritha turned from the garden, her eyes adjusting quickly to the gloom of her parlor, so empty and neat, as though she had never even lived there. At least in her garden she had made her mark. She filled her old leather canteen at the sink, giving the smiling Leviathan a fond pat as she shouldered her pack, the keys left upon the table as she headed for the door. Cellophane was on the front porch, long sword at his hip and wide hat pulled low over his eyes in anticipation of the day. She reached for the handle and pulled the door closed, her hand lingering on the smooth globe of wood. This was it. She would likely never see this house, this city, or even her friends ever again. For a moment, the sense of loss was overwhelming. Cellophane shifted at her side, grey eyes watching her from the shadow of his hat. Had he felt the same all those months ago as they had panted and scrambled up that dark earth tunnel? His voice was gentle with a sympathy that suggested the possibility of it.
"Are you ready?"
She let her hand drop and turned to step down from the porch.
"Yes."
They made a brisk pace to the city gates, the cool, grey dawn leaving the walkways empty and the air damp. Fritha's skin shivered, a hollow nervousness churning in her stomach, a mix of too little sleep and worries for the journey she was about to embark upon, and she was glad when the walkway at last opened out to that wide platform. A group of 8 lightly armored scouts, a woman and 7 men, were already assembled loosely before the wide trunk, their commander standing a little way from them. Not that he had any mark to show him as such, the man clad in the same light leathers and long padded jerkins as the rest of his company. But it was clear from his manner he was one who expected to be obeyed, narrowed eyes watching their approach from behind a chin-length sweep of blonde hair, the rest tied back and tucked under his burnt brown cloak. His face was as handsome as it was stern, thin lips twisting with an obvious dislike as they arrived before him.
"You have come, then, the Drow and the Ballspawn. I am Captain Fernil, the leader of this company and commander of this assignment. I will speak this now and frankly, it is only my unwavering loyalty to my queen that induces me to tolerate such company within my troop. We head south and we do so at our pace. Do not think I will delay our mission for the weaknesses of your kind, whatever insights you may bring. Keep up, or be left behind."
Fritha just caught herself from sending a glance skyward. Oh, Elsyme had to be having a laugh. Cellophane looked as though he was about ready to strike the man, Fritha letting surreptitious fingers hover lightly over his wrist as she sent Fernil her sunniest smile.
"Well, now that those pleasantries are out of the way, shall we be off?"
It was a cold morning that promised to become another warm, fine day, the arc of sky above a clear, faded blue while in the east a golden mist was lingering still over the dark forest, the trees casting long shadows across that mostly sleeping camp. Valigar shifted where he was seated on his pack a pace or so from the mouth of his tent. He would have to take that down soon, as well. His boots were slick with dew from the lush grass and wet enough that he was glad he had not made a seat of his cloak, the ranger leaning forward to poke at the small fire he had coaxed into life a while back, the damp wood smoking about the small pot of water he had hung over it in anticipation of the morning's desired tea. He was not even sure why he was awake, why he had risen early and packed up the few items he had brought with him. He did not believe for one moment Suldanisselr was in any danger, from giants or otherwise. But Imoen did, and the two women had agreed last night to return that morning, and for some reason unknown to him, he had offered to attend with them. The man snorted to himself, giving the fire another half-hearted poke, feeling frustrated by his own irrationality. He was supposed to be shouldering the responsibilities of his estate, and yet here he was, gallivanting off at the first chance. He wondered if his presence was even welcome. Imoen had not tried to apologize again after he had left her on the walls, and he had noticed a marked coldness in her manner towards him ever since he had returned with Jahara. Though he could understand it, she may have surprised him, but he had hurt her feelings. At the tent next to his, a great bald head was slowly emerging, Minsk dragging his bag with him.
Good morning, Minsk. You are packed, you plan to leave early with the order.
The Rashami frowned and shook his head.
No. I am coming south with you and the women. Long into the night the Boo and I talked. I know I should return to the city and continue to seek passage north, but young Fritha is my friend and I cannot leave her to this peril. Minsk, there is no evidence that she or anyone else in Suldanisselr is in any sort of danger.
Minsk sent him a measured look.
If it is so, then Boo wonders why you are going.
Valigar flushed and made no answer. In truth, he did not have one to give.
Minsk and Boo will travel south. If all is fine as you say, we will have lost but a fortnight and the journey north may still be made. My people would see me return for judgment, but good Dinaher held high the value of friendship and it is her example I shall follow. This will all come to naught,
muttered Valigar sourly.
We press south just on the basis of a few rumors and a young girl's fretting.
Minsk was frowning again.
You may say that, but sometimes such feelings are sudden and heavy, and must be followed to their end.
A rustle at the tent flap opposite, Jahara emerging back first and still arguing with the girl she had left.
Where is the tea, Imoen? You've packed it, already? Yes, yes, but we have time for one cup. Ah, Valigar.
She sighed, finally straightened and turning to face the men.
You are packed, I see. And Minsk is up, also, you are here to bid us farewell. No, Boo and I are joining you. Joining us. Jahara, morning you lot,
greeted Imoen, the girl interrupting the druid's questions with her appearance, already on her knees as she set to pulling the tent pegs from the soft earth.
Jahara, the tent's empty now, I'm going to start collapsing it. Yes, fine,
the woman sighed, clearly trying not to lose temper with her chivying, her exasperation fading in a smile as her eyes caught on the figure moving steadily toward them across the camp, a no-man already dressed and armed, his breath misting in the cool air.
And here is one who is here to make his farewells. The order depart soon, a no-man. Within the hour, my lady, many were only allowed a day's absence. And yourselves? As soon as we can,
Imoen offered with an impatient glare to the others, as though to remind them that this would be a lot sooner if they would stop chatting and get on with it. A no-man nodded.
I wish you safe journey then.
He swallowed, something of the emotional about him as he turned back to Jahara to press.
You understand, my lady, had I any more leave myself, I would be accompanying you.
Jahara offered him an unusually sympathetic smile.
We understand. Do not concern yourself, a no-man,
Valigar sighed.
There is likely nothing amiss. If you think it's nothing, then go back to Athkatla,
snapped Imoen.
I know of at least one person you can make the way with.
Anomen flushed, but said nothing, Imoen wiping off her soaked knees to march past him.
I'm going to ask the kitchens for something for the road to trade meat.
The camp seemed to breathe a sigh as she left.
We are about to take tea,
continued Jaehaera.
Will you have a cup with us?
Anomen dipped his head in apologetic decline.
Ah, no thank you, my lady, I have yet to pack. May I ask a favor of you then?
Said Valigar.
My estate will be expecting us back this day.
The knight anticipated his request.
I will send a squire over to explain matters. I am grateful. Well,
Anomen sighed, something of the melancholy creeping in as he surveyed them.
I wish you all a safe journey.
And Valigar watched him move off through the tents before returning his attention to the fire, Jaehaera stirring tea leaves into the simmering water. When had Anomen become so sensible? And when had he become one for a fool's errand?
Here, Anomen.
Anomen started from where he had been pushing a half-eaten chop about his plate to find a large hand being waved before his face as Simon at last stood and leaned across him to fetch his own carrots, the dish in one hand and serving spoon in the other as he returned to his seat with a sigh and a frown.
Goodness, Anomen, where are you today? Sorry, I was just thinking,
Anomen muttered, the man suddenly wondering how he had managed it in the tumultuous clatter of the refectory at dinner. So, continued Simon, smiling again as he returned to his plate,
tell me about the wedding then. There is not much to tell. I stayed mostly in the company of Squire Varen and the others of the order. And Lady Brianna,
added Simon, the grin broadening. Anomen bit back a sigh.
Yes, and the Lady Brianna. Well, what else?
Anomen made no attempt to suppress his sigh that time.
Simon, it was just a gathering. I spoke to the Lady Nalia and wished her well, I saw my former companions but briefly just after the ceremony and then...
He trailed off as he recalled it once more, stood in that dark courtyard in the surrounding press of guests as he and Jaehaera had related to each other the last month, when Valigar's arrival had interrupted them. Imoen was apparently having a fit about something, and would Jaehaera come now? The druid had excused herself, and it was as he had been standing alone in that throng that he had realized it. He was an outsider now, an acquaintance, someone with whom they could share a polite word or two at a wedding, but he was no longer a part of their group and their troubles were not for him. He had been told later by Minsk that Imoen had heard reports of the troubles in Tethur and was worried for Suldaneseller. They were not concerns anyone else had shared, including himself, but the girl would not be comforted and it was all Jaehaera could do to dissuade her from setting back to the city right there and then.
And then?
Prompted Simon. Anomen started back to the table once more.
Oh, and then we met later, as well.
His friend was frowning.
Is that all? You've been in a very odd mood since you returned. Have I? Yes, most certainly. Are you sure nothing happened? No, nothing. No altercations, no disappointments.
Anomen scowled, he did not like the route this discourse seemed to be taking.
At what are you driving, Simon?
The squire looked suddenly sheepish.
Well, Irlena mentioned that Fritha wasn't there, and I was wondering. Not everything has to come back to her, Simon,
he snapped sharply. His friend shrugged, turning pointedly back to his meal.
Fine then, as you would have it.
But these crossed words killed the last of his appetite, and Anoman retired to his room soon afterwards, the man sinking onto his bed as though Altoriel was pressing down upon him. Everything felt so confusing. He had worked his whole life to be where he was now, a knight of the order, and yet he had never before considered what it would actually be like. Of course, he had had a good idea. He had been a squire there long enough, serving in campaigns with his brothers as he worked to prove himself. But then he had joined Fritha and the others, and he had been given a taste of a freedom he had never before enjoyed in his life of rules and structure that had begun since the seminary. He was happy there at the order, but he missed his old life, too. Here his days were spent drilling the younger squires and men-at-arms, awaiting the time when the order would next marshal its forces, or he was perhaps selected to join some smaller quest. It was all he would have wanted before he was knighted. Now it did not seem enough. The older, more established knights had more freedom in where they chose to wander and the causes they took up, but that was only after they had many campaigns behind them, such trust earned rather than given freely. Anoman heaved himself up again, crossing to the window just for something to do. Brianna and Irlina were on the canals below, the latter talking to one of the guards outside the temple to Lathander. The women looked fair in the fading sunlight, graceful even from this distance, one head shining gold while the other was a burning blot of auburn, when suddenly she had turned and Brianna was staring straight up at him, eyes trained upon his window high above. Anoman froze, his heart pounding as though been caught doing something he shouldn't, though he realized almost instantly she could not have seen him, not at that height. Irlina spoke a word at her arm, and Brianna turned back to the conversation with a smile. Anoman stepped back from the window, heart still rattling in his chest. Fritha dropped her pack to land with a rustle on the forest floor, her body aching all the more for this sudden release. The day had been a hard one. Captain Fernil had marched them south at a pace she could match easily enough, though not without an effort that her weakened body was not used to giving, and she felt now as though she could just fall asleep where she stood. Next to her, Solafane looked little better. The day had been hot and all the more, she suspected, under that hat, an underlying current of animosity that was directed mostly at him souring the close air. She scrubbed a hand over her face, trying to wake up a bit as those about her fanned out, dropping their bags, as well, to begin unpacking as the dusk drew in. They had finally halted for the day in a clearing that seemed created for that very purpose, the small glade already cleared of branches and rocks, a stone-ringed fire pit sunk into the center, while 3 thick logs had been set about it to serve as benches. Fritha willed herself to move to her own pack, but this respite of the body had allowed other aches to surface too, her mind drawn back to Suldanissellar and the friends who would soon be returning there to find her gone. Would Elsime remember her promise and tell them she went to Candlekeep? Fritha hoped they would take the Queen's word for it, and merely await her return, at least at first. She could just imagine Jahara's displeasure if the woman, just arrived from had to hike twice that distance north again, back up to the western heartlands to be told Fritha had never even arrived. They would probably be angry though, once they did find out, and likely hurt, too, and she could see Imoen's face, pale under the scattering of freckles and bright-eyed as her friend realized her duplicity. Fritha slumped onto the nearest log with a weary sigh. Why was everything so hard?
Are you well?
Asked Solafane, glancing back to notice her there. She heaved herself back onto her feet with a wan smile.
I'm fine, just a bit tired.
Fernil was barking orders in his native tongue. The elves had been speaking Elven all day, though not to her, perhaps they did not think she could understand them.
Vestal, Tandeth, set to collecting some firewood. Bryn, you know where the nearest stream is, Avalar has the cooking pot. The rest of you, begin pitching the tents.
Fritha sighed again, stooping to unpack the elven-made tent that had long ago made the journey with her to Athkatla and back.
Right, Cellophane, you heard the man. You understand them,
the Drow confirmed mildly. Frithha nodded, passing him up a bag of wooden pegs.
Yes, my Elven isn't as good as, say, my Netherese, but it's better than my Alzito. Even if I couldn't understand a word, I'd get the gist from that look, she added, eyes drawn to where the brothers, Cephas and Orville, were watching them over the canvas peak of their own tent, sharp faces close as they whispered, their pale hair glinting gold in the dying light. Frithha returned her attention to the man beside her. But you can speak in Elven, too, if you would prefer, Cellophane.
The Drow was frowning, narrowed eyes still fixed on the pair across from them.
I would not. I should practice my Condatan, and I like to hear you in your native tongue, it is familiar. You two, hurry yourselves,
snapped Ferdinand's brusque comment.
I understand your kind prefers the sweat of slaves to your own, but we have not such luxuries here.
Frithha bit back a sigh, gathering the jumble of poles into her arms and taking a few paces to the glacis edge, Cellophane following with pegs and canvas, muttering in his own tongue.
Cellophane! Does he not anger you? Anger me?
Frithha repeated, genuinely surprised by the venom with which he had hissed the question.
We fought for his city, you spent your life to save it, yet he speaks to us with nothing but contempt.
Frithha let the idea mull a moment as she pegged out the canvas.
I suppose I never really thought of it like that. But to be fair, I didn't save Suldanisseller for him, particularly, I saved it because it needed to be saved.
She sent in the last peg with a well-placed blow of the mallet, and made to stand once more, perhaps too quickly, the girl for a moment dizzy as she left her head at her knees. Cellophane was frowning again.
Sit, Frithha, I will do this. No, no, can't have the good captain thinking I am making a slave of you, can we?
It just seemed to have been assumed the two outcasts would share a tent. Cellophane appeared more troubled by the idea than she. Perhaps he had not before had the necessity of sharing rooms and tents with sometimes his entire company. Frithha hardly cared as long as she didn't have to share with Fernil, the man turning from where he had been helping the auburn-haired Vestal to light the fire.
You two. Finish that tent and set to the next. For a man unused to slaves, he surely knows how to treat others as them,
muttered Cellophane audibly. Frithha glanced up as the copper-skinned Tandeth arrived beside her, the wood elf casually brushing his dark fringe back from his eyes as he stooped to help her peg out the next tent, the older, golden-haired Avalar helping Cellophane with the poles.
Good cousins,
began Tandeth, his voice just low enough to be lost in the activity behind them,
try not to take what the captain says with offense.
Frithha summoned a smile of her own as proof of her goodwill, as if she gave a dried fig what any of them thought.
Ah, we don't, do we, Cellophane?
The Drow said nothing, Avalar perhaps sensing this silent dissent.
Please do not judge him harshly, his son was lost in one of first Drow attacks upon the temple.
Tandeth nodded, the wild crop of hair falling into his eyes once more.
He was young, some say too young for the duties he was given. He was taken below to their city and never seen again.
Frithha swallowed, the guilt rising hot in her stomach as, for a moment, she was back there, watching that young elf warrior tremble and sweat before her, as, at her side, Feyre savored the scene like wine. The tents up and fire lit, the night seemed to close in quickly. Their group sat about the stone-ringed flames to eat their meal of flatbread and cured squirrel meat, Vezela enchanting the group with a long elven ode from their native Everesca, her dark hair swinging about her as she swayed to the accompaniment of her husband, Jastron's, flute, before all bedded down for an early night. Neither she nor Cellophane had been given a watch. Frithha seeing this lack of trust as a distinct benefit if it afforded her more sleep, the elves about her retiring to their tents, some just laying cloaks beneath the star-shot canopy to lie or sit in blank-eyed reverie. The darkness of their tent was a heaven of blessings for her tired eyes. Frithha, dropping instantly to her knees upon the cushion of bedding and blankets Solafane had taken the time to lay out, the man behind her and waiting patiently as she turned to remove her boots before pulling her legs inside as well, the Drow following after a moment, and they were both within, knelt upon their bedding and packs at hand as they turned their backs to change.
"You have been quiet this evening." "Have I?"
she asked, voice muffled as she hauled off her tunic and camisole in one, and pulled on the slip she had laid out ready.
"You are thinking on your friends."
Frithha slipped off her trousers and finally turned around, Solafane clearly hearing her movement as an indicator it was acceptable for him to do the same. The man now changed as well, his leanly muscled chest bare above a pair of thin trousers of ash-green linen that looked much darker in the gloom.
"Thinking on my friends?"
she repeated, having to consider the question.
"No, well, no more than I was yesterday."
And it was the truth. She did miss them, but the feeling was hardly a new one. She had felt the same when she had been back in Sultanaselar, the girl unable to interact with them as she once had, never quite shaking the feeling she was somehow letting them down, the way Jahara had watched her with so keen an eye, and poor Imoen, constantly tugging at her sleeve, cajoling her along. And though she was sad it had come to it, a part of her felt relieved to be finally accepting her destiny, a certain melancholy pride coming from the sense she was sparing those dearest to her from its path.
"Then someone here said something which troubled you?"
Solafane pressed, settling down amongst his blankets. Frithha shook her head, the uncomfortable weight in her stomach growing heavier as he neared to the truth of it. She leaned over her bag to swap her hairpins for her brush as she made to comb her hair out for the night.
No, nothing like that. It's just when Avalor told us of Ferdinand's son. When we were in the Ustnatha, when I was Vuldran, I went to a gathering of Faeras and for our..."
She swallowed past the sudden nausea.
"Entertainment, 2 elves they had captured were made to fight to the death. One of them was so young, and scared almost witless. I wonder now if it was Ferdinand's boy taken into the darkness to die."
She paused in her brushing, Solafane watching her in silence, his hair overly white in the gloom.
"His older companion won the duel and was to be dragged screaming to the altar. I set up an escape attempt and cut his throat before he could reach it." "You did all you could,"
said Solafane quietly.
"Did I?"
She sighed, hairbrush left in her lap as she began to weave the braid in which her hair would sleep.
"I sat there and watched as one man was forced to kill another, and all I could offer the survivor was death. Was that the only way, or was it the only way I could see at the time? Perhaps if I had waited until we had left the chamber, killed the guards myself and, I don't know, just let him escape the city, then..."
Solafane did not let her finish.
"Then he would have been hunted down and killed, and your failure may have earned you a similar fate. I do this, too, lie awake mulling over all the things I did, once willingly and then to maintain my bloody facade as a loyal follower of Lolth. Was there not more I could have done, and if not, why did I not try to leave the city sooner?" "And why didn't you?"
He sighed deeply, the blankets whispering with his shrug.
"I do not know. I was as any other drow in my earlier years, keen to prove myself to Lolth and House, and crawl my way up from the slavery in which most males are kept. My change in outlook was not some sudden revelation, but a slow awakening. As I rose through the ranks, so did my disillusionment with the life in which I found myself. Was this all there was? Killing for a goddess who would never be sated, for a matron who could never have enough power? As my importance grew, so did my dissatisfaction with what it had earned me, that which I had once so desired suddenly worthless now won. I had slaves of my own then, gold if I wanted it, the attentions of higher-ranking females, what did any of it matter? I was still as much a slave as when I was birthed. We all were, slaves to our fears. So what changed? I was out of the city, on campaign with many warriors of Ustnatha. The Illithids were encroaching on our western territories and we had been sent to drive them back. After many days of diversions and sneak attacks, we raided their burgeoning stronghold and slaughtered them to the last, though this victory did not come without cost. The commander of our company, a notably fair and noble man in that world of betrayal, had taken too many wounds to be saved. He called me to him as he lay dying in his war tent. He knew his end was upon him and likely did not care any more. He told me he had watched me over those last few years, recognized the dissatisfaction that had once mirrored his own. He told me of another way, another path meant for us Drow.
Sullivan shook his head, ruefully amused by his stubbornness as he confessed,
I could not accept his words at first, though I carried the secret of all he had spoken for a long while afterwards and slowly it worked upon me. I had found a book in amongst his belongings, though I did not open it until many months later. It was nothing much, just some scraps of vellum, handwritten prayers and ceremonies to the goddess and her doctrine, but I treasured it all the same. His last words to me had been to open my heart and Illustrae would enter, and by her grace, she did. Yet, still I remained within Ustnatha, slowly rising through the ranks of the male fighters' society. At first, I convinced myself I would find no better welcome on the surface. The only tunnels I knew of led out in the forests of Suldanissellar and the elves there were used to our raids. I would have been slaughtered on sight. Then I met Feyre and I thought that perhaps my place was with the Drow, spreading word of my goddess. Did you ever tell Feyre of your faith?
He snorted bitterly.
I would hardly be here talking with you if I had. I loved Feyre, and the warmth she showed to me made it hard to admit that, though the capacity for such love was within her, she was Drow and very much her mother's daughter. I would see her tender passion when we were alone together, watch that verve sparkle in her eyes, only at other times to be confronted by her ruthless joy at the downfall of an enemy or her lust for battle and blood. I tried to convince myself she was merely playing a role as I was, but no, she was not ready to open her heart to Lady Silverhair. Just to you,
said Frithla quietly.
Yes, just to me and how she suffered for it. After she was taken by the handmaidens, I did not know what to do. At first, I waited for Feyre to return to me, but it soon became evident that the woman I had known was gone. I became more reckless then, visits to the surface around Suldanissellar, one of the few pleasures left to me in life, though I still always stopped short of leaving Ustnatha for good. So what made you finally decide to leave? You mean after years of dreaming of the surface, what made me want to go with you?
Sullivan sent a contemplative frown to the canvas above them.
I thought on it often while you were away in Athkatla hunting that vampire.
He shifted, turning to gaze up at her, grey eyes reflecting silver in the half-light.
Do you recall what you said to me, Frithla, as you stood before me in my chambers, smiling down at me with a compassion I had never before seen upon the face of one of my own race? There is a place for you on the surface. Did you know those are the words of my lady, Illustrae? Whether it was a coincidence or she herself had some hand in it, I may never know, but it was what I needed to show me the time had come to do what I had both longed for and feared since Feyre was taken.
Frithla shrugged mildly, at last reaching the end of her braid.
Well, it wouldn't surprise me if your goddess had had some influence there. Everyone seems to want to make use of me for some divine errand or another. Right before entering the Underdark, I was being heralded as the Shark Father's blessed savior. I sometimes think we all have it wrong. It's not Ballspawn, it's Ballspawn.
He chuckled quietly.
Does anything faze you? Oh, plenty of things,
she smiled, a hand in her bag and absently rooting for her hair tie.
But not that, not anymore. I have accepted it now, and perhaps there is a little of life left to be enjoyed before the end must come.
she sighed, nestling down under her blankets as he had.
We had best get some sleep while we may.
A silence fell over them, just long enough for Fritha to realize how loudly the breeze was hissing through the leafy canopy far above them, when
Fritha, do half-elves reverie?
The giggle bubbled out before she could stop it, a high, childlike ripple that came straight from the last unburdened corner of her heart.
If they do, I never have. Cellophane. Yes, Fritha. Do Drow snore?
The darkness could not hide his smile.
You will have to tell me tomorrow.
End of chapter.